Radiation has a long history. Was discovered in 1895 by Roentgen. By 1912, the first book was published on radiation-related cancers, and it took until 1929 for the radiologists to finally form a committee, and they did it to protect their own health. Hermann Muller got a Nobel Prize in 1944 for showing the dramatic genetic effects of radiation on offspring. So it wasn't an unknown substance. Muller wrote an article in 1950 that talked about weakening the species. You're putting more radiation waste in the environment, which is hard to cope with, and you're producing people who are less able to cope with it. And you can't keep doing this. Anybody with common sense knows that you're working at both ends to really destroy the species. Depleted uranium is a waste product from the nuclear industry. In the 70s, there was talk about mixing it with ordinary metal and putting it into bicycles and refrigerators and stoves and automobiles. We raised quite a fuss at the time and opposed using it for any civilian purposes. But what happened very quietly is behind the scene, the government gave it free of charge to the weapons manufacturers. It served the purpose of getting rid of the radioactive waste, and it provided free metal for the weapons manufacturing.
They have a weapon that is unbelievable. If you are only interested in fighting wars, you have a trump card weapon. Nothing can withstand depleted uranium. There is no tank, there is no armor that can withstand a depleted uranium shell. One of the things we were always told around the military environment is that the military takes care of its own. And I think we're learning that their idea of taking care of their people is very different than our idea of taking care of their people. But it's used because it's a very effective armor penetrator. It's incredibly dense. It's more dense than lead. And it slices through tank armor like a knife through warm butter. It's used in many weapon systems, including the M1 Abrams tanks, the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle, Tomahawk cruise missiles, the A-10 Thunderbolt, known as the Warthog, and the Navy's Phalanx anti-missile system, which is on board every ship in the U.S. Navy.
Now, what are the dangers faced by our troops and also civilians in that area? This dust gets everywhere. It spreads into people's homes, it gets in your lungs where it stays for a long period of time, and people who have gone into these areas with large quantities of uranium dioxide show that the radiation count is about 1,000 times higher than what it is in terms of the natural background. Now, let me explain. Just by living on the planet Earth, you get about 100 millirems per year of radiation. That's a very important number, 100 millirems per year of radiation. However, once you are at these sites where you have depleted uranium being emitted, you can easily get up to 200 millirems per hour. So in other words, upwards of 1,000 or more times background radiation. In other words, it's like getting a chest x-ray every few minutes. So once you begin to inhale this material into your lungs, small particles of uranium dioxide will begin to irradiate the nearby cells. And all that radiation is then concentrated into a very small area. So you have potential radioactive hotspots in your lungs as a consequence of this. So precisely because alpha radiation is not very penetrating, all of its energy is deposited in the nearby area of the areas that are affected. And the Pentagon itself now mentions the fact that there's a possible kidney, lung, and liver damage. Uranium comes in two basic forms, U-235 and U-238. U-238 is the most plentiful found in uranium ore. However, billions of dollars have been spent by the superpowers trying to extract U-235. U-235 is very rare, and it is the stuff of atomic bombs. Once you mine, mill, and enrich uranium, you have the byproduct of this whole process. Now, this material is very cheap. In fact, the United States sometimes even gives it away for the military to be used for specific purposes.
If you've ever handled DU, you know that waste uranium, if I were to hold it in my hand, just a small sphere of it, you'd go like this. It's unusually heavy, deceptively heavy. A small piece, smaller than a softball, weighs 1.7 times that of lead. It's one of the heaviest of all known metals because of the fact it has 238 protons and neutrons in the nucleus.
As a consequence, the military likes to use it in shells, in shell casings. Now, when it hits armor steel, it actually will penetrate the armor steel and vaporize in the process. And that's where the danger is. Depleted uranium is not unradioactive. It's still radioactive, it still emits alpha radiation, and that's one of the main concerns. Approximately 375 tons of depleted uranium were fired in the form of shells during Gulf War I. And during the recent Gulf War, we're talking about perhaps 1,000, maybe 2,000 tons of this material was dispersed in the form of uranium dioxide. Now, the Pentagon, by the way, has its own rebuttal. The Pentagon, first of all, points out that we are talking about low levels of radiation, which is true. However, I should point out that this material has a half-life. The half-life of U-238 is more than 4 billion years. That's approximately the lifetime of the solar system, the sun, the earth, or about 4.5 billion years old. Uranium is basically an alpha emitter. There are three kinds of basic radiation, alpha, beta, gamma. Uranium is primarily an alpha and a gamma emitter, and alpha rays can be absorbed by tissue paper. Therefore, what's the problem? Well, there's a problem here. Precisely because alpha rays can be absorbed by tissue paper, most of the energy is then lost in that tissue paper, causing an enormous amount of damage per centimeter, much more than you get with beta radiation. Think of a crowd, and you have a speeding car plowing into the crowd. The car, of course, does not go very far into that crowd of people, but think of the damage. Think of the damage caused by the car plowing into a crowd of people. That's alpha radiation. So precisely because alpha radiation is not very penetrating, all of its energy is deposited in the nearby area of the areas that are affected. And the Pentagon itself now mentions the fact that there's a possible kidney, lung, and liver damage. The Pentagon's own documents reveal the fact that yes, there is a distinct health hazard. In fact, the military personnel are warned to stay about 75 feet away from this material precisely because it is radioactive. Gamma rays will go right through lead. You can encase DU in solid lead and you'll have some gamma rays coming out. Now, this is without people's permission, not to mention the fact that even if you are in a tank sitting next to the depleted uranium shells in their shell casing, you're also being exposed to large quantities of gamma radiation because you are in close proximity to these shells.